Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the June edition of the Airport Restaurant and Retail Association Monthly Forum, where ARRA keeps the conversation going to evolve a sustainable, resilient, and flexible business model for the airport concessions industry. I am Andy Wettig, Executive Director of ARRA, and I thank you for joining us. Today, we continue our mini-series taking a look at the state of the industry 2 years into the pandemic. We will hear from two veteran ACDBE concessionaires to give us the ACDBE and indeed the perspective of all small business concessionaires on the impacts of the pandemic, state of the recovery, and future for this important segment of the entire concessions industry. We welcome Bill Swift, owner of Business Traveler Services, Inc. and Swift Services, Inc., and Greg Plummer, CEO of Enjoy Repeat, Inc., and CEO and managing member of the Concord Collective. Both Bill and Greg have many years of experience in this business and currently operate concessions in several airports, and each has experience operating as a joint venture partner as well as independent concessions under direct leases to airports. And in Bill's case, he's experienced with several business cycles in the aviation industry, including Eastern going out of business, 9/11, the 2008 Great Recession, as well as, not to mention, COVID. So welcome, Bill. Welcome, Greg. Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to talking with you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Bill, let me start with you for a second, Bill, because you operate in a whole variety of businesses. You operate retail stores, you operate as a consultant, you've been consultant to food and beverage concessions, you operate services and have operated in the automated retail arena as well. So could you tell us a little bit about your business, about Business Traveler Services and Swift Services, Inc.?
Well, you described much of it right there, Andy. The reality is that from being on the retail side, and in fact, Savannah Candy Kitchen is a retail operation. That's an example of saying, at the same time, the vending business, which we've done with Best Buy, CVS, and others, providing those recognized names, and to even on the ATM side, we're the partner with Truist Bank for the ATMs in Atlanta, as well as with TravelX, providing foreign currency exchange, and we're the prime for that as opposed to a joint venture. So I've worn probably every hat that you could wear in this arena. I've worn it one time or another, or currently wearing it.
So that gives you this wealth of knowledge to and experience to help us out today as we try to assess where we are and how we're going forward. I imagine that you, along with everybody in this industry, lost 95% or so of their sales at the depth of the pandemic, right at the beginning of it, and have slowly recovered. We are still recovering. But tell me a little bit about how you and your various businesses managed to cover those losses during the past 2 years.
Let me put one item on the table that helped. Shortly, probably within the first 3 months after the pandemic, and we could see the drop in sales, the loss of revenue, one of my business partners, and we had been in business for more than 24, 25 years, decided to pull out. So in effect, that reduced the drain on cash flow by a third. Well, that was unexpected, but it was helpful. And I think he was at the point in life where he looked at retiring and not wrestling with more of the problems of an airport or not controlling the environment that he was in, pulled out, and that helped him. It also helped me and my partner, Anita Leopold. We remained in place and then started scrambling for what else can we do with the platform that we currently have? And how can we manage our cash flow to sustain us through whatever length of time this is going to take? We had no idea, as most folks did not, that we'd still be talking about COVID 2 years after the fact. But I think it was our, pardon the expression, our swift response to the conditions that we were under. And that helped us. And also, we stepped up on reducing the number of personnel we had by a third. That too helped. And we went to our financial institutions that were carrying one or more notes with us and pointed out the fact that a condition has taken place. We didn't bring it about, but we're here to respond to it. And we need you to respond with us. And that seemed to be accepted. But they still were asking us, well, what is the airport going to do? What will the airport help? Or how will the airport help? And without getting into the details, I'll leave that as an introduction. But there was a rather robust response from the city of Atlanta. And I'll explain that as we go through the rest of this presentation.
That's Atlanta did have one of the more robust responses in support of its concessionaires. Greg, you're primarily, maybe exclusively in Los Angeles at LAX, and they were very hard hit because of the end of international travel for a while there. And so, how did it affect your businesses?
Well, yeah. Well, first I want to say the fact that I'm here today with Mr. Swift and Mr. Weddick, I'm honored and I feel like I've made it, so
that's due to Bill.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, gentlemen. And, to that point, yes, LAX is one of the hardest hit airports because of international traffic taking a massive hit in addition to domestic traffic at the airport. And, as a result of it, yes, I was a part of a joint venture where I owned a significant portion of it, 25% of a business. And I was partnering with a wonderful company, SSP America, and we were fixing some challenges we had already had pre-pandemic. And then this hits and really kind of disrupts things. So, this opportunity created the opportunity which I have today. So, talk about making lemonade from lemons, and then, working with the airport, working with city council, and really storytelling, because the airport was under a lot of pressure from, other entities, i.e., the union, who has a very strong presence here in LAX, as they should, because they represent the workforce. And then obviously concessionaires from all business channels, really asking what's going to happen. And then also URW working together with us. So we did a lot of storytelling. The ACDBE community here really band together, which was something that had never happened before. We created a whole video series, really educating the public, the city of LA, the city council members, the mayor, to our stories and how we are equitably impacted by the pandemic. And it was really, kind of a lot of collaboration and really difficult and honest conversations that got us to a point. And ultimately, we've been able to right-size the ship. We didn't get a program as robust as Atlanta. But we did get a program that helped us, really begin to recover. But as a result, I, personally impacted by a lot of pressure from my lender, who, quite frankly, did not care that it was a pandemic and does not care it's a pandemic. And I won't get too much into it, but, unfortunately, that is something that we're still working through.
Which creates a different kind of atmosphere, I would imagine. So in terms of the scale of your businesses versus the scale of many of the primes, and creates a different kind of financial challenge, I would imagine. You want to talk a little bit about that, Greg, and then over to you, Bill?
Well, yeah, sure. The scale was, I'll kind of just jump ahead, is we, as a result of this opportunity, or, never waste a good pandemic, but this was something we had never experienced. I worked for a company.
That's usually never waste a good crisis. We don't want too many pandemics.
Right.
I think you're correct. I apologize about that. But, this opportunity came about of a crisis. And really, when my back was against the wall, had to figure out how to make this right. So was able to acquire the business we have today during a very hectic time, and like I said, during the middle of a crisis, and one of the hardest times to ever go out and raise money. But believing the industry would come back, just had to double down and kind of go with a gut reaction to, one, this too shall pass. People are humans, they want to get out and move. So really, from a business standpoint, had a lot of honest conversations and really use this to create the opportunity I am today.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned storytelling, Bill. I imagine that the situation you faced in Atlanta and perhaps elsewhere also involved a lot of storytelling.
It did, but we don't have enough time for all the stories. I'll just I'll give you a brief piece of it. Having been involved with the airport industry for all these years, and when Eastern Airlines went out of business, it was totally an unexpected occurrence. Here you had a legacy carrier, Eastern Airlines, had close to half the gate space for the domestic concourses pull out overnight. And and the airport responded. It took a while. It took over a year to try to figure that out. The same thing occurred with 9/11, which was another one of those, suddenly things changed. It was no longer the same. And the airport took an inordinate amount of time to respond to it. We learned something in both cases. In both cases, we went to the airport first. We realized that was a mistake. Not because the airport wasn't or might have been receptive, but they were handcuffed by the rules and regulations associated with the contracts that all of us had. And when we went to them thinking, because they were closest to the problem, that they would be receptive to a solution. Well, they were, but they didn't have the tools. Going past the recession period and skipping that and coming up with COVID, several of us immediately got together and concluded we need to do something about this. And I'll name Mac Wilborn and Daniel Halpern and myself got our heads together, and we immediately concluded that it was important to reach out to the other concessionaires. That's where the little player, as in ACDBE and the small operators, had a collective voice rather than a single voice. I mean, it's about a number of voices. We went that route, and that really, I think, made a difference, because we were able to walk through, all going through similar problems, and understand what those problems are and see if we can get a consensus on what the solutions ought to be. And because some of the members of the concession group had 2 years, 5 years, 8 years, and some had long tooth time in this industry, we're able to give a historical perspective that got everybody on the same page. For the most part, everybody on the same page for the first round of getting some legislative adjustment. Put some money together, got some thoughts together, and went to several players of the council and the mayor and presented the story to them. Here are the details of what's going on. Here are the problems. Now, from where they sit, they're not dealing with us on a day-to-day basis. So it was important for us to bring them up to speed to demonstrate to them the impact of COVID. They had no idea. At the same time, presenting to them was turning and explaining to them as well that the airport administrators had no toolkit. They didn't have the tools to make the adjustments that were necessary. So in both cases, we had to bring them together and say, the airport administrators need the tools that we're going to suggest. And at the same time, we need to make sure that what we're suggesting can be done, or that there's a willingness to get it done. And unfortunately, some thought it was a political move. And to some extent it was. Hell, the people that decide what the legislation, what our contracts look like, are the political players, the council, the mayor.
Yes.
But they're interested in making sure that the #1 airport, the busiest airport, does well. And oh, by the way, let's not forget that one of the strongest, the most demonstrative efforts in terms of minority and small business participation took place in Atlanta, because
Yes.
Maynard kicked that off. Well, we sold that as we cannot afford to fail. We cannot afford to be responsive, supportive, and sensitive to how we go about fixing a condition that we did not create. And I think that took us a long way with the first round of legislation and then the second round of legislation, which is what we're participating in and enjoying today, that really worked for the condition. Now, some have said it was very robust. Well, damn right it was, because it was necessary. This was the pandemic, the COVID pandemic was not a lightweight issue here.
Right.
There's few things we've gone through in history, of those of us in our lifetimes, can say that we've gone through 2 years of a condition that to a large part of it we spent at home. And we were told that's the best place for you.
Mm-hmm.
I can't repeat another time. So if that's the case, then we needed enough tools, ammunition, and right-minded thinkers to get to the same place and understand this is what we're going to do to make sure we do not lose, one, the smaller minority players who are at risk. They, as you alluded to earlier, the small players don't have the bankers in one or more cities that they can go to and say, look, cover this, do this, extend this. We have enough hard assets to support our requirement. Operators in the concession business have few assets, and
Right.
especially if they're certified under the 1.3 million, you've maxed out when you sign the contract. So what assets do you, what collateral do you have to support the loans that you need to carry you through a period which you don't have any cash flow, and convince the bank that that makes sense to them? So I think, Andy, in a large way, the experience of having gone through similar conditions was what was brought to the table with our concessions group that understood here are all the facets, all the factors associated with the condition. Not one, not two, but there's a handful of them. And if you only go piecemeal, you're going to get a piecemeal result. If you're going to now save this patient, I don't want a clerk coming in to save the patient. I want head of surgery to say something about what we want to do. And then bring in the right team of players to make it happen that way.
Very
And
true.
I think that's what we did.
Very true. Well, you were successful, but you had, let me jump on something you said earlier, though, Bill, that was very good, and then turn it around a little, twist it a little for Greg. You said you cannot afford to fail on this program. But let me add to it, we also cannot afford to not recover. And Greg, so let me ask you, Greg, where do you stand? Where do you think the small businesses at LAX stand in terms of their current financial health? How do we restore the financial health to get to a recovery?
Well, Andy, it's a very complicated question, but how we got into this position and how we've been able to weather the storm is through a lot of collaboration, working through kind of payoff agreements, really carrying large balances, which I'm sure make our landlords a bit uncomfortable, but understanding that if the revenue is not there to support those expenditures, which one could argue should they have been abated, i.e. storage, rent, and kind of common area maintenance fees, and all the things that really are ancillary to the business, possessory taxes, things that really impact our P&L other than the MAG and the percentage rent and the labor costs. So we really were able to work with our landlords to develop what would be an understanding of how we get a payment plan in place so when things do recover, we could then work these balances off. So as by definition there, we're already looking at several years of recovering, because essentially taking on additional debt. And then, whether you're an ACDBE company, as Bill said, you don't have the banking relationship or the assets to be able to go get additional lines of credit to create, a pipeline to be able to kind of weather the storm. So you've accrued late payments and additional interest fees and things that really, again, go to what's already, on your books, and you're going to carry on over time, work through. So it did take a lot of those creative and or necessary measures put in place to be able to kind of get through one, reopening, bringing back the workforce, and then fixing the business. Obviously, when restaurants sit, in our case, we're a restaurateur. When restaurants sit for a very long time, there are lots of costs that people don't even imagine that you have to then make an additional investment to get those pieces of equipment back up to speed and running properly. And some of it never recovers, so you're actually buying new equipment. It's a lot of different nuanced issues that people don't think about. And it's something that, we really try to do a lot of educating, our business partners so they understand it, so that they say, well, things are back. MAG starts back July 1, 2022 in our case. Well, and we appreciate the relief we've gotten, right? But when MAG starts back, that is another pressure that we're going to have to face. And kudos to Atlanta for being able to work out, a further extension, because really you're paying percentage rent. You're able to, obviously pay your share as a result of what the business generates, but doesn't take into consideration there are additional expenses and interest charges and things that have accrued that are very different on a small business P&L that is, in comparison to large one. And then large companies have, different challenges of their own, but I can only speak for our company. But ultimately, as Bill said, we can't afford to fail. And the airports, we know that they don't want us to fail. So how do we work through this? How do we kind of learn from this exercise? How do we put new measures in our contract to allow for, in the event that something like this happens, God forbid something like this happens, and that we have a measure that says, okay, well, this kicks in, and we know that we have some kind of downside protection. Right now, I would argue that the small business or ACDBE is taking a disproportionate risk when you look at their participation in the business model. And it's a great business to be in. We all love this business, and probably wouldn't change it for the world, but there are some things that we could tweak and that we've learned as a result of the last 2 years and the learnings that can certainly impact the way we do business moving forward. And I think should be a part of the conversation at all airports across the country, because ACDBE and small women-owned businesses are such a critical part of that success and them accessing these federal dollars. I think this is not that business is business, not personal, but we just want to be successful as well, right? We've put in years and years, in my case, 18 years in this business to realize and come to this moment in time where I have a chance of becoming successful. And that's really, really, on one end, makes me really happy, but it also makes me very, very afraid at some points. And I have a lot of sleepless nights, and I got to turn to my wife and say, no, it's going to work out, honey. Trust me, it's going to work out. And, TBD. I do feel like we're going to be successful. But again, I think we have a lot of work to do in educating, everybody about. A lot of people are now entertaining this conversation. Our airport partners, in our case, developer URW, they're at the table saying, yeah, how can we help you? And we want to, understand it, because maybe we don't understand all the issues that affect you. And the airport's doing the same thing, and they're bringing us in the conversation. And that's a good start. I would say that's a great start.
So Bill, please add to that, Bill. How does Greg
to the extent
how does Greg avoid sleepless nights?
Well, I haven't had too many sleepless nights, but I will say this, that as Greg alluded to earlier about take advantage of the crisis, in a sense that we've done that by bringing attention to how this industry works and how delicate it is in keeping it in balance. We've got these contracts, and the members of council or the mayor see those contracts, the award of X amount of spaces, get back, and the concessionaire guarantees a certain amount of payment and rent. and they're done, and not realize to the extent that we invest in those spaces, it is our dollar that builds those spaces, not the airport's dollar that builds those spaces. So that means we put our rear ends up for grabs here if something happens. There's no recourse when your space that now is running between $750 to $1,100 a square foot. Nobody thought we'd have those kind of numbers, but that's what it is. So if you take 1,000 square foot location, it costs you 700 to $1.1 million for one location. And if that location happens to be on the concourse that traffic has not come back to, you're up the creek. So I think what has happened, we've had a chance, and we still have a chance to sell the case, not only locally, oh, by the way, on a federal level. The legislation that members of Congress approved for concessions specifically was based on some concessionaires that went to the congressional leaders and explained what the story was, what the problem was. Because the airports didn't do that. The airports didn't go back to the congressional leaders and say, look, we need additional dollars to address them. They got their dollars and the airlines didn't do the same. So neither one of those major players did anything that spoke specifically to, well, we got some concession operators, both big and small, that are going through this period here and threatening for them to be out of business, no fault of their own. So to some degree, we have now lifted the skirt, if you will, of the issue. And now we need to we now need to get in front of and continue to get in front of some of our congressional leaders on the federal level and see what may be next in support of the small and minority operators and sustaining them through the lifespan associated with running airports. They have done that through federal dollars in a major way. The infrastructure bill is huge amount of dollars in support of our airports. They need it, no problem.
Yes.
But there's nothing specific to making sure that the concessions program, it wasn't included. And I say that. But just as the congressional leaders included $1 billion plus for concessions, the same approach may be necessary. We may need to start looking at, let's re-examine the rules of the game that make it more inclusive to those who also have a lot at risk. And in many cases, not just their job as it is for some of our airport leadership and airline leadership, but in fact, whether or not I still have a roof over my head or food on the table. Many of the small operators are that close to where am I going in terms of making sure I got a roof and food on the table. I've taken this risk. I buy that. But at the same time, I want to be sure that the universe of decision makers are aware of and considerate of what it takes for this business to work. How do we have more direct contact with the traveling public,
Exactly.
for extended periods of time than any other aspect. Short of you getting your ticket, okay, now what? You sit in a plane, okay, now what? But you sit in that gate hold area or go through security, you go through the airport, and you expect food, clothing, services readily available to you, especially in America. We've become accustomed to it's right there. It's a moment away. So how do we make sure that part of the business, that part of the system, the ecosystem serving the public stays complete and also inclusive?
Well, and Bill, I just want to mention one other piece to that because, you know, also beyond that, if you look at the airport as an opportunity, what we're doing is creating jobs for those otherwise overlooked. And, you know, we're making a huge impact on the local community and providing above living wage jobs with full benefits in the city of Los Angeles. And we're working through the challenges, taking the risk. And yeah, I mean, we are doing it for the sake of making a good living and, realizing success. But again, the risk needs to be shared, and we need to look at the model and say, are we a passenger amenity? Are we there to service the public? And what is the fair amount and what we should share in that so that it makes sense for all parties? Because as you look at the news today, inflationary measures and the cost of goods and the cost of construction, you mentioned 750 to 1150 in Atlanta, and forgive me if I got that wrong. We're looking at 1,400 to 2,000 a square foot in LA, and it's really due to market conditions and limited contractors willing to come into the space. And I'm not saying anything that's kind of a bombshell. Everyone knows this in our ecosystem, and people are actively working on it. But it's going to, instead of encourage more people to come into the business, is going to discourage people to come into the business. And ACDBEs and small business are a vital part of this ecosystem. It's a necessary part per the regulations. And if that's the case, we need to figure out how to make it more beneficial or attractive for smaller companies to come in. And I stand on the shoulders of people like yourself and the mentors that I've worked under that I got a chance to learn this business from very closely. And I understand what it used to be and where it is today. And we're in very different waters than we were, kind of even 10 years ago. And, if we don't get ahead of this, it's going to really derail all the progress that's been made by people like Maynard Jackson and Andy Young and the Clark Sharps of the world. The people who really, like I said, yourself, people put themselves out there, advocated for the small guy, made sure we had a seat at the table, and made sure we had a piece of the pie to now really make sure that's sustainable. And then we continue to move it forward so that, we continue to see more of this instead of less of this.
Both of you have touched on a number of elements of a future model or a place where we should be, not necessarily a future model, but a place where we should be. Let me ask about recovery though. Does incorporating these elements help define what recovery is? Is recovery more than just getting out of debt, let's say? Is there other things that we should look at for a system or an industry that is recovered, truly recovered? Because we aren't there right now.
But if I might say this, Andy, recovery is a difficult term for me because recovery suggests that the period that we went through for the last 2 years, we're now going to be over it. And we need to get you back to complete what you lost in the last 2 years to make you whole there. And you're now at the same par level you were prior to the period. So I'm going to look at it this way. It's similar to COVID. COVID, those folks that I know that went through COVID became ill. They can't recover other than being well again. But they can't get back that week or that 30 days or that month and a half or those 3 months that they were going through COVID. What you just hope for is that they're now at a place that they're similar to what they were prior to the period, but you'll never be able to catch that other stuff back. So the recovery is, maybe I'm defining it wrong, but it strikes me as, no, where we are now is that the platform of where I can take my business is a platform that's survivable, and I may be able to grow because I'm at a place that I can produce, I can participate, I can seek new or expand what I'm doing. What I lost, and I'm going to have to live with that. And perhaps what I can do in terms of recovery is more in the terms of, what do I do going forward? How do I prepare myself if there's a similar incident like Eastern going out of business, a Concourse shut us down, one of those airlines that we thought was secure is no longer secure, or one of the legacy carriers stopped serving an airport. Similar, if you will, to what went on this past weekend. We had a couple of legacy carriers not following through on a schedule because they didn't have enough pilots. There may be
Right.
another reason, but people didn't get back and forth as expected. And therefore those concessions that were there didn't receive those passengers. No problem, not caused by them. So in a sense, where we are now is thinking to ourselves, what can I do to make sure that I'm better prepared for volatile conditions that I don't control? And part of that is not just what I can do for my personal operation or my staff members, but what can we do to make sure that the airport has the right tools to respond in a speedy manner? You know, there's trouble with, I don't overly criticize how swift the airports are. They're just not as swift as I am, I think. But they're a machine. And what we need to make sure of under these conditions where we have an easier way to look at how we address conditions that we don't create, that impact our traffic levels in a magnified manner. So part of it says, let's go to council, mayor, airport administrators. What language do we need to have in our contracts that would allow you to have a prescribed manner of response? That you have the rights to do it, that there's not a draconian approach to it, but you have rules and regulations in place that you can respond in a matter of weeks, not months or years. Because you've now had an experience, if you don't do anything else, Eastern Airlines, 9/11, COVID, all those things happen, and it happened it directly affected the airports. We've got some experience now. I mean, we have a think tank, think that through, and maybe come up with some prescribed manners of response. Take the politics out of it where possible, because there's not the pressure to respond to a crisis condition. And I think we'd be better off.
In effect, establish the rules for when you're friends, because when you have to look at that section of the contract, you most assuredly won't be friends.
Well, it's difficult to digest. I will say this, the Atlanta contracts have in there a clause based on 9/11. And that is, if this traffic is dropped by more than 25%, your rent is automatically adjusted.
Right.
Trouble is, it takes too long before it takes effect.
It takes too long, and the impacts are immediate.
That's correct. So we learned something, and that's one of the elements that our concessions group is going to wrestle with, how to get to the right folks and present the case for giving their administrators the toolkit to make them successful in administering the airport's requirements. And something that we can also predict. We know what the conditions are that will pull this trigger or the next trigger. And I think that's part of the difficulty, as you mentioned, when you start looking at the contract, you got a problem.
You got a problem.
You got a
You got a
problem.
problem. So Greg, what does this definition of recovery make sense to you? Or, I mean, but to me, you also have, I mean, yeah, the losses are the losses, and you have to deal with them, but they've also set you back.
Yeah, certainly. I think it's just the opportunity is right now to look at the agreements, as Bill said, and really come up with mechanisms in place that give some level of protection, that we can work with. And yes, things are recovering, but now you have a new set of issues that are emerging, which we don't know how that's going to have an impact on our business. And I'm generally an optimistic guy, and I spread the optimism wherever I go. And I'm a team player. However, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't concerned about what happens next. And once we get through summer, as business travel recovers, do we see a complete drop off again? And soon as we can ramp up, we ramping back down, when are cost of goods going to normalize? When is traffic and, cancellations going to normalize? It's just a lot of uncertainty. And, I think that's what we signed up for. But in business, I think we use this recovery and define it as there's a chance right here for us all to come together, put together mechanisms that make sense, and look at it honestly, because I don't think that I think that we've all built rapport with our airport partners right now. We've had some really tough conversations, but generally I feel like even airports feel good about their ability to finally get to a point where they provided relief, because they knew that there was a chance that some people are going to be out of business. And it's never a good thing when anybody makes a large investment is willing to walk away from a contract. It's just not good optics. It's not a good business environment. But it happened, and it happened across the country. And for various reasons, I think we really need to look at this and say, maybe it's time, the industry says it's time to make a change. And hopefully this has got us to the point where everyone's willing to have that conversation.
I think we are. I think we're at that stage now where we have to evolve a business model that's sustainable and resilient, and to use the current buzzword, agile. Gentlemen, this has been very, very interesting, very fascinating, and very informative. We've got a few minutes left. Let me ask you, Bill, what is, you talked of the toolkit. Is that, you think, the most significant long-term impact from COVID? Or is COVID really not that distinct? It just isn't fresh in our memory. It's a brand new phenomenon. It had a very significant major impact, of course, a serious impact at that. But is the economic response really different?
Let me put it this way. COVID kicked us in the shins, and then punched us in the stomach. And it's to that extent that says, wait a minute, I don't have to get kicked in the shins again to know that what it feels like, because it's going to be followed by a punch in the stomach. I think we've all been there. We know what that's like. So what I think we should be doing, and as I allude to it with this toolkit, this is a two-way street on this toolkit, because we have to make sure that those who administer these contracts over us as concessionaires, both primes and airport operators, that they have the tools to make the adjustments and modifications that keep us both flowing, keeps this process moving, without the threat that if I don't get some legislation or somebody to be really kind to me, I'm out of business. I want to try to keep it on the basis of the tools allows a kind of equal approach to all the players. A sensitivity that we have a mixed bag of players, and the tools are identified for that purpose, so that when someone comes, I don't have to run to the mayor or the member of council or someone else on the staff. We've got a prescribed arrangement of, here are the things that we can do to respond to a condition, and we can keep the business moving. You too, as the operator, has a better understanding of the responses relative to your situation. And I think that's a huge step in the right direction of getting us past, we got to reinvent the wheel every time we go through a crisis.
Exactly.
I don't like the crisis mode approach. I much prefer, it's difficult, but we have manageable steps. When there's a fire in an airport, the worst thing that could possibly happen in the airport is a fire. One of the worst things that happen in the airport is a fire. But there is specific steps that are supposed to be taken for the safety of the passengers, the safety of the employees, and keeping the building intact as much as possible. We have a sprinkler system that all of us are required to make sure it's part of our location. We have a response period. We have messages, information that goes out, tells you what to do and how to do it. So why not we take this as a method of saying, if we have a fire described as COVID-19, we have a good idea of how our response is. Where there's a fire truck that rolls in and guys jump out and hose it down, can we do that? I think we can. I believe, and one of the things I like about this industry, got a lot of very smart people in each segment of it. The suggestion is getting some of those smart people together and start looking at this total picture as opposed to my cubicle or my silo. And a more universal approach, I think, will be better off for all of us.
I think so. Greg, we'll end with you, Greg, about parting thoughts on never wasting a good crisis. Because it sounds like what we're really looking at is what we gotta, not wasting the crisis means getting past the crisis and getting out of crisis mode to plan for the next one, to improve to build that toolkit.
Yeah, I think Andy, I think Bill said it eloquently, and I know there's a lot of work at the federal level, and ARRA has done a fantastic job of really advocating for our industry. And each industry has had their own lobbying efforts to get to a point where their issues are on the table. And not that there's not going to be one person, like to use the Maynard Jackson reference, that came in and really said, no, we have to fundamentally change the way we do business in order to make sure minority and women contractors are in the conversation. In this case, our entire industry is still trying to recover. And I mean, the airport, restaurant, retail industry is trying to recover, parking, you name it, right? The whole ecosystem. We need a concerted effort, and we need somebody to really step up and champion. We as operators and owners of businesses are saying, here, these are issues. And I don't know if they're getting the full merit of what they are, because people think that we're taking advantage of a pandemic, right? Or taking advantage of a crisis. But it's a real issue. It's a real issue. You see it in every industry where you're seeing people respond to this and saying, we need to fundamentally change the way we do business. And I would just call to action and say, we need to sit down and work closely with the airports, the big airports, and understand, and small airports, understand what can we do collectively and where can we come to a common ground to fix these issues, to have a plan in place in the event that, one, God forbid anything happens like this again, but right now, we're still in crisis mode. We're still trying to recover. How do we put something that's meaningful together and really move it forward so that we can put this behind us, and the advocacy is done for the benefit of everybody. The high tide raises all ships. And right now, yes, traffic is coming back, but we got our own new set of issues. How do we fix this right now so that we can now put this behind us and we can all focus on our business and focus on giving a great guest experience? And there's a lot of conversation, but if that's what the common goal is, we all want to give a great guest experience, right? We all have to be profitable in order to continue to grow. Then how do we do that? And then there needs to be, my last push is, there needs to be a real push around a fund to help companies like ACDBEs, small business and women-owned businesses, to be able to access capital that's not predatory. And because we don't own these assets, we don't own the assets, and there's not a model that really lends itself to traditional banking. And if you are certified based on the network caps, then how are we supposed to continue to grow? So there needs to be a fund, and there needs to be concerted effort, and it takes collaboration to get us to the point where there's a fund and there's economics and business terms in place that are bankable, to where everybody sees a return. The passenger sees a return because they get a great experience where they're not being charged an exorbitant rate. And we're not looking for opportunities like, how do we raise our prices more? How do we, all these things that go into the the pot need to be considered so that we all can just really be viable. And that's all we want, is to be viable. And we appreciate the consideration. And I think now people are having a conversation, but it needs to be a more robust conversation.
Well, gentlemen, then, as I mentioned, very, very informative, insightful, inspiring even. We've gone over a little bit. So on behalf of the Airport Restaurant and Retail Association, I want to thank you, Greg Plummer, and you, Bill Swift, for joining us today as we turn our eyes to the ACDBE and small business perspective of the current state of our industry. Thank you very much, gentlemen, and very helpful. And thank you, everybody who joined us today. Hope you found it informative as well, and look forward to seeing you next month on I think July 6th for our next monthly forum. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you very much.
Hey, Andy, make
Yes,
sure
Greg.
everyone joins ARRA. We need more members. We need participation.
Okay, Greg is our membership chair, so that was an official message.
We need you. Join ARRA. Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Yeah.